I've been very strongly opposed to rigid inflation targeting in all countries. And I think that the crisis is in part a result of central bankers focusing excessively on inflation. That is to say, because they were focusing on inflation, they, you might say, lost the thread. The thread is financial stability, growth, broader issues. And so I think one has to put a lot of responsibility on central banks that were focusing excessively on inflation. Now, inflation is, when it gets out of control, is a serious problem. So I don't want to, and I use the word excessively rigid inflation targeting. I don't want, you have to worry about inflation when it gets too high. But you have to balance that with other concerns. And I think there has been a major change in central banks, woken up, most of them, that they made a mistake and that you need to look at financial stability. They acted as if low inflation was necessary and sufficient, low commodity, low consumer price inflation was necessary and almost sufficient for economic stability. And I don't think anybody believes that anymore. They should not have believed that before. We had an ample record of evidence against that view. And it is really an illustration of, that I'll be talking about a little bit this afternoon, of really bad economic work in economic theory. Because what they were focusing on, the models they were using, talked about the distortions caused by relative price changes associated with moderate inflation. Well, the losses of economic efficiency caused by the meltdown of our financial system are an order of magnitude bigger. So they were focusing on something that was second, third order of magnitude when they should have been focusing on something that was really important. And I really think economists have a lot to blame for that. Now, for developing countries, for small open economies, and South Africa is not is somewhere in between. But for small open economies, for instance, like Botswana next door, you look at the data. Only 25% or more of the price of the commodities are affected by interest rates. You have, the price of food that's imported is determined by international prices. Other prices are administered prices. And so what are the prices affected by the interest rate? Very small fraction. So to put all the burden of adjustment on them was absurd. And particularly when you had inflation and energy prices going up as they were in 2007. To bring inflation down would have been worse. By raising interest rates, the cure would have been worse than the disease. So, and more generally, I could go on, but let me just say, more generally, the notion that the appropriate way to adjust the macroeconomy in response to a shock, regardless of its source, a shock that leads to higher prices, is to raise the rate of interest, it's just wrong. It's not. There's no economic theory behind that. That it is not necessarily the best way of adjusting to a macroeconomic shock. So it's been a real costly mistake for governments to have pursued this. Now, most governments by now have moved to more flexible inflation targeting, and when it becomes soft enough, then it becomes just one of the list of things that monetary policy has to look at. And that's the way I think it ought to be. This was a crisis that actually was pretty easy to predict. The fact that there was a bubble, a housing bubble in the United States, and it was inevitable that housing bubble would break. And it wasn't just that it was a housing bubble. The housing bubble was sustaining a consumption boom In just 1 year alone, Americans took out about $900 billion out of their houses, and it was clear that once that broke, the economy would go into a recession, and the longer it sustained, the deeper the downturn. So the only question in my mind was, economists can identify the underlying forces. We're not very good at timing. I jokingly say if we were, we would be much richer than we are. It was clear that it was going to break. We couldn't tell when it was. And the longer it went in on, the deeper the consequences would be. There are, one of the things I'll say in my talk is trying to understand what went on is sort of like peeling back an onion. You have to explain, why did the Fed let the interest rate so low? Why did the banks manage the risk so badly? Why did the regulators let them get away with that? And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. But the underlying economics were very clear, and it was unfortunate that the government, the banks, didn't do what they were supposed to do. And our whole system of checks and balances didn't work.